On Monday, October 22nd, 1962, the day had not yet ended when something out of place already made itself felt. When she came home from school, Susan Miller found the television turned on, not as background noise, but as the absolute center of the living room. In middle-class homes on Maple Street in Omaha, the TV usually stayed off during the workday, switched on only in the evening for the major network newscasts. The exception that afternoon needed no explanation. It meant something extraordinary was underway. The male voice coming from the screen kept the measured tone of official announcements, and Helen sat on the sofa, hands motionless in her lap, without the sewing that normally filled her afternoons. Susan stood still near the door, her blue coat hanging from her arm, aware that she had entered a familiar space that, without any visible change, had become something else. When she asked if she could get an apple, her mother nodded without taking her eyes off the screen. In the black and white broadcast, maps of the Caribbean appeared and disappeared, overlaid with lines, circles, and arrows indicating ranges and routes. Graphic devices typical of early 1960s explanatory television and used heavily that night after the presidential address. To an 8-year-old girl, those images meant nothing. To the adults, they condensed a precise threat. The air in the house felt heavy, like the moment before a storm that did not show itself in the October sky, clear and still. Even so, something seemed about to happen. Susan lived with her parents in a post-war residential neighborhood. Single-story houses with basements, fenced yards, trees that shed their leaves early in the cold of the Midwestern plains. Life there followed rigid schedules. Dinner at 6, bath afterward, the monthly civil defense siren at noon on the first Wednesday. Part of an alert system actually maintained in inland cities near strategic Air Force installations and regional command centers. So when those regularities began to fail, Susan noticed. That night, the television stayed on during dinner. Helen did not hum while cooking. The kitchen clock seemed louder than usual. When Robert came home from work earlier than his normal hour, he told no stories and asked no questions. He went straight to the AM radio, turning the dial in search of updated national bulletins. The next morning, Tuesday, October 23rd, teacher Margaret Keller announced a different kind of drill. She did not explain why. Her posture was too rigid, and she repeatedly smoothed the front of her skirt, a mechanical gesture that betrayed tension. She asked everyone to get under their desks, a practice associated with duck and cover drills promoted since the early Cold War and reinforced in official civil defense materials. There was no smile, no reassuring phrase. Susan smelled varnished wood and chalk dust as she crossed her arms over her head, following instructions. They stayed that way longer than usual. Muscles began to ache. From the hallway came a low hum, probably a radio on in the teacher's lounge, that Susan associated, without understanding, with the television at home. The following days moved slowly. On Wednesday and Thursday, the drills were repeated, sheltering under desks, lining up in the hallway, hands clasped behind the neck, as prescribed by civil defense manuals distributed to public schools since the previous decade. On one occasion, the blinds were closed and the lights turned off to simulate a blackout. The room became dark and stuffy, filled only by restrained breathing. When one child whispered question, Mrs. Keller's sharp reply revealed more nervousness than authority. The apology that followed, her face flushed, made it clear that not all adults had answers. At recess, teachers stayed grouped together, speaking in low voices. When Susan asked what the drills were for, she heard only that they were a precaution, a word recurring in official statements during those days, repeated in speeches, radio bulletins, and notes sent to schools. At night, at home, her parents talked in whispers after bedtime. The radio stayed on at minimal volume, picking up CBS and NBC broadcasts that regularly interrupted programming between October 22nd and 28th. Susan pressed her ear to the pillow, trying to make sense of fragments, ships, blockade, days, terms that did not form a story, only a constant state of alert. Without anyone suggesting it, Susan began to organize herself. She started carrying a sweater in her backpack, even on warm days. She kept her lunch money in a separate pocket. She carried her handwriting notebook with her name and address, information considered essential in evacuations, according to period pamphlets. At night, she mentally repeated phone numbers of relatives in Des Moines and nearby neighbors, afraid of forgetting them. Fear did not present itself as politics or war, but as the vague sense that continuity depended on small acts of preparation. On Thursday, October 25th, the siren sounded outside the scheduled time, not at noon, but during math class. The metallic sound cut through the building at full intensity, signaling an unannounced test, a practice technically permitted under readiness protocols, but rarely used to avoid panic. The children reacted without instructions, seeking shelter automatically. When the sound stopped, silence was complete. The principal spoke over the loudspeaker, stating it was only a test, in accordance with procedures. The hesitation in his voice, however, contradicted the message, something Susan registered without being able to name it. That night, Robert took his daughter to the basement, a space many Midwestern families informally adapted as a shelter even without certified structures. He showed her the blankets, the flashlight, the bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. He said they might need to stay there if the weather turned, a common euphemism in domestic conversations of the period. Susan observed the raw concrete walls and the small, high windows typical of houses built in the 1950s. She asked no questions. She had already learned that certain explanations would not be given. On Saturday, October 27th, Helen baked bread at home, a less common habit in the early 1960s when industrialized foods predominated, but one that resurfaced in moments of uncertainty associated with both household economy and self-sufficiency. They kneaded the dough together, and the warm smell spread through the kitchen, creating a brief sense of normality. Shortly afterward, the radio interrupted programming with an urgent bulletin about negotiations underway between Washington and Moscow. Helen turned up the volume, just enough to hear. On the night of Sunday, Susan was allowed to stay up past her bedtime. She sat between her parents on the sofa while the television showed maps and images of civilian and military authorities, already indicating a gradual easing of tension. No one explained the content, but no one sent her to her room. Robert's arm rested on Helen's shoulders, a simple gesture that concentrated the exhaustion of the previous days. When he took Susan to bed, he said in a routine tone, "It's all right now." Susan believed him, but in a different way. On the morning of October 29th, the television was off and unplugged. Helen opened the windows. Robert whistled as he got ready for work. At school, the drills were suspended, and Mrs. Keller resumed reading aloud. At recess, teachers dispersed. The siren sounded at noon, as scheduled on the monthly calendar. Apparent order had returned. For the adults, those days became a closed episode. For Susan, they did not. She continued to organize her backpack, memorize numbers, watch adults for signs. Something had shifted silently and permanently. Years later, as an adult, Susan would hear that period called by the name it had never been given in her childhood, the Cuban Missile Crisis. She would learn about the missiles installed on the island, the naval blockade, officially termed a quarantine, and the decisions made far too distant from Maple Street to be explained to a child. The knowledge clarified the facts, but did not erase the experience. Even decades later, when packing a bag or memorizing a phone number, Susan still carried that quiet lesson, born during a week in which nothing happened, and yet everything changed. If you found this story meaningful, please consider liking this video. It helps these quiet, often forgotten stories reach more people. Subscribe to Ordinary Lives, Extraordinary Times to stay connected to stories of everyday people who lived through moments that shaped history. Each life mattered. Each story deserves to be remembered, but we'd also love to hear from you. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Our community spans across countries, generations, and experiences, all connected by a shared respect for history and the lives within it. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive.